Can I welcome our second panel of witnesses this morning, all from BBC Scotland, who will give evidence on broadcasting. We have Ken McQuarrie, John Boothman, Bruce Malcolm and John Mullen. Welcome to all of you. Can I thank the witnesses for their further written evidence on BBC Scotland's preparations for the referendum and the Commonwealth Games. And can I start the questioning with a question for myself? I presume you've heard the evidence this morning from Professor Robertson, who's just left, and obviously you've responded as an organisation to his research. Could you tell us, Mr McQuarrie, why you took the view that it was necessary to respond in the way you did to Professor Robertson's evidence, his research?
Yes, I can. I think, first of all, to put in relation to Professor Robertson's report, it would be worth just putting a couple of points on the record, convener. So just saying a few things about the report. We read the report with some interest, but we have some serious concerns with it. And these pertain in particular to elements of its methodology and to its factual accuracy, its findings and its conclusions. In all of these areas, we believe the report displays fundamental errors, and it is for this reason that we question its validity, and our concerns are detailed within our report, which we understand has been distributed to committee members. When the report was first published on a website, it was not sent to us for comment. We were alerted to it by concerned members of the public, but even on a cursory examination we could see errors in it, and we contacted the author, copying the university, given that it had been published with the university's logo appended. It was entirely proper, to my mind, that we did so, and the content and the tone of our communication was also entirely proper. We asked if we might see the raw data, as we did not recognise the evidence presented in the report as an accurate reflection of our broadcast output, and the request was rejected by the report author. What the report does make clear is that its evidence base was a series of transcripts of broadcast output. We are not, unfortunately, in a position to say how accurate those transcripts were. However, given the number of factual errors in the report, it is at least fair to ask the question. We are aware that the version of the report presented to the committee differs from that originally published in January by the author, with one or two of the errors we pointed out now corrected. That said, the vast majority of them remain. In the original research, it is claimed that it is the weekday bulletins that are the focus. We pointed out that the report's own figures were therefore out by over 200 hours. In this latest version, I see it now claims that all the weekend bulletins were considered, and that the figures have been revised down by around 100 hours, from 730 hours to approximately 640. It seems that the author is unclear about what or how much news is covered in the report, and it's on that basis that the entire report is predicated. The report does make a number of allegations about our news coverage, as it does about STV. We completely reject those allegations, as we do the questioning of our journalists in terms of both their professionalism and what they've brought to air. The evidence it presents does not support the contentions it makes, and its conclusions are based largely on flawed analysis or occasionally intuitive guesswork. It is not a piece of analysis based on empirical research, as it claims to be, but rather a highly subjective and selective assessment of our news coverage. It's important, I believe, for the committee to note that the BBC is governed by the requirements of our editorial guidelines and Ofcom's broadcasting code. It is against this criteria that our impartiality is judged. And we are entirely confident that not one of these examples would have fallen foul of the criteria employed there. I would also note that we do take full cognizance of sound analytical broadcasting research, such as from Seesaw to Wagon Wheel report on impartiality published in 2007 and Professor King's report published the following year. Now, I have to say our questions are not with Professor Robertson simply The report is published on the website of the University of the West of Scotland, and we welcome all contributions to the debate, but we feel it's important that where there are errors of fact, that we make that clear.
Thank you for that comprehensive response, Mr Macquarie. Can you tell me how many pieces of academic research, I'm sure you'll have to guess this if you can, how many pieces of academic research in a normal year, a normal 12-month period would BBC Scotland cover?
How many people?
How many?
Almost, I can't give you an exact figure as to how many we cover, but clearly in our news broadcasts we feature a whole number of different pieces of academic research.
It's a lot, isn't it? I mean, it's a regular occurrence on almost a daily basis.
I couldn't give you an exact figure for it.
Yes. Can you tell me on how many occasions you expended BBC resources on, to be polite about it, tearing apart any pieces of these academic research and reporting that research to the principal of the institution from which the research comes?
Well, first of all, this piece of academic research was about our output, and we're simply not, our desire is not to tear it apart, simply to put on the record where there are factual errors. In terms of reporting it to the principal, we copied, as it was on the principal's, the University of the West of Scotland, we copied the principal. That seemed to me perfectly reasonable to do. I don't see it in any sense as a piece of academic research, which is always welcome in the debate that we're involved in, as reporting. I couldn't see
about this research. I mean, we know what you did with this research. What I'm asking about is in all of the many hundreds of other bits of research, academic research that you report every year, can you name the number of occasions where you did a similar thing?
No, in general terms, I can't name a specific instance where we would have copied the principal in a piece of academic research. What we do in our journalism is test and debate and discuss that academic research on a regular basis. And Professor Robertson, on the aforementioned research, was given the opportunity on Good Morning Scotland to put it to use.
So can I just be clear on what you're saying? So the answer would be none at all?
Not to my knowledge.
Right, so this is the only one where this has happened?
To my knowledge.
To my knowledge.
As we currently stand.
Yeah. Don't you find it rather peculiar, wouldn't you, or wouldn't an ordinary person looking at this find it rather peculiar, that the BBC accept academic research day in, day out, respond to that by publishing stories on it, having debates on that research, but on this one occasion, when the research is about your own output, that's not how you respond in an entirely different way?
I don't think it's peculiar in the slightest. We wanted to correct the errors of fact, that were in the report, and I think it's perfectly reasonable when it is about our own output, and it was on a question, if you like, of our impartiality, that we would get the facts on the table, and we wrote only to Professor Robertson and copied to the principal.
I'm quite surprised by that answer, because it seems to me, frankly, astonishing that on no other occasion do you expend effort in trying to analyse research that's produced by academics, and you've said so. There's been no occasion to your mind that you've ever done this before, but on this occasion you do spend, seems to me, quite substantial amounts of effort in attempting to discredit the research of Professor Robertson.
We do not wish, we simply wish to ensure that we have registered that the factual base of this research is in fact incorrect, and we wanted to supply example by example for Professor Robertson with the true facts.
Okay, George Adam.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question with regards to, do you get quite a lot of complaints, Ms Macquarie, regarding some of your coverage?
We do get a number of complaints across all of the BBC about our coverage on any given subject, and we also get a lot of plaudits, and we get a lot of comment, which is both neutral and a lot of inquiries. So we've got some a high volume of engagement with the public.
Do you have any actual figures on the number of complaints you receive per year, per annum, per...
The number of contacts would be, in terms of with BBC per annum, would be of the order of 1 million per annum in individual contacts. In terms of breaking them down, can't give you a breakdown at this
Continuous current affairs and BBC Scotland? No.
At this particular occasion. If you wish, I can supply that to you.
Okay, that'd be interesting.
Mr Adam, if it's helpful, I would say in the past couple of years, with the onset of the referendum and in relation to some things and stories we have done in relation to Scottish football, there has been a rise in the number of complaints that BBC Scotland has dealt with. We try and answer each individual complaint as promptly as possible.
Okay, thank you for that.
Clarify something. Did you say, Mr Macquarie, that you're willing to supply the committee with the total number of complaints broken down, whether it's football or whether it's to do with the referendum?
No, we wouldn't be able to do that. What I think we were asking in terms of the generality of the number of contacts we had with the audience in a particular year.
The question was about complaints, though. So, are you able to give us a number of complaints that you received?
We wouldn't normally do so as a matter of course in the BBC, but that's...
But you don't, well, the reason I asked is because, of course, I myself have put a freedom of information request to you and you refused to answer, to tell us the number of complaints that BBC Scotland receives. But I thought you just said you would supply the committee.
No, I said the number of contacts.
So you won't supply this committee with the number of complaints that BBC has received about the referendum coverage?
In terms of specifically about the referendum coverage, no.
No. Why not?
I think that's, in general terms, we use that contact, where we reply to each individual complaint, and first of all, the body that would release that information is the BBC Trust rather than the executive, and we would not break it down.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to understand why you wouldn't do that. I mean, clearly, you're a body that's paid for by the public. Surely the public have a right to know about the level of interest or complaints about your output.
And the Trust regularly publish the data about the number of contacts on an annual basis. Yeah,
I'm not asking you about the number of contacts, Mr Macquarie. I'm asking you about the number of complaints you've received from the public about the referendum coverage.
Specifically, we would not break down the complaints into subject-by-subject areas.
Okay. Sorry, Mr Adam.
Just to go on, has there been a cut in the amount of people that are delivering news and current affairs in Scotland, BBC Scotland at the moment?
I think in the current position that we're in relation to the run-up to the referendum, because of the £5 million of additional investment just to Scotland, there are more people currently working in news and current affairs than I think there have ever been.
So there's more people than there's ever been?
Yeah, because we've added up to about, John, I think nearly 50 staff in the past year to deal with the referendum and all of the additional output that we are providing in the run-up.
Flagship shows like GMS and Reporting Scotland, the main news show, they're actually to get more people working for them.
Yeah, if I can give you some examples of that. You'll have read in the press recently that, for example, Sarah Smith is coming to present a new programme called Scotland 2014 that will start at the end of May, that we're employing the chief reporter from the Herald has recently joined us, a correspondent, an economics correspondent, Coletta Smith from Northern Ireland has joined us. We've got Laura Bicker, who's now been seconded to being a political correspondent. We've got 14 new news trainees. We have more producers coming to join us in order to fulfil the obligations that we have in relation to the extra coverage we want to do. We told the committee the last time we were here that for the period of the referendum, for that fixed period, we would be employing up to 50 additional staff to deal with all of the new output that we propose for the referendum, some of which I'm sure you've already seen. We've had a number of debates and a number of documentaries, as well as beefing up some of the staffing round about some of the programmes.
Mr Boothman, I'm slightly confused, and it may be entirely my own fault in this situation. It might be a permanent state of confusion I live in. But the NUJ have been telling us on numerous occasions that they believe that their staff's under more pressure. We've heard in various media outlets that there's the shift patterns change to such an extent that producers are working through the night and then doing some of the early morning stuff. So if we've got so many people working for BBC Scotland, how are we still getting this from people who are employed in the actual industry then?
At the end of the day, as I say, we've had £5 million of additional investment for the referendum. We're employing, as I said already, up to 50 additional staff. We went through a period until the end of the financial year, the last financial year, where we did make some savings, which resulted in a number of redundancies. But since then, for the period of the referendum, as well as our permanent staff, we've had that additional £5 million and an additional 50 staff.
Mr Boothman, of the 50 additional staff, what is the breakdown? Is it new staff, newly qualified? What is the breakdown?
Well,
John?
Yeah.
So 50 staff have joined the referendum unit. All of those staff are contract, so all the contracts run out at the end of the referendum period. Many of those positions are for documentaries, so they are effectively 3-month contracts. What we've done is we've beefed up online with 4 new employees. We've got probably a dozen or so working on documentaries at any one time, but that's a rolling figure. We have a very gold standard form of training scheme for the trainees. They do 3 months extensive training, and then we put them around different programmes. So some of them are attached to online, some of them are attached to radio, and some of them are attached to TV.
We've got more than we've ever had. Effectively, it's all temporary contracts then. It's all until the referendum's over.
Those 50 are temporary posts, yeah.
Okay then. So effectively, basically in the middle between the two stories is there has been a change in the way you're working, you would say, but the NUJ would say there's been a cut in the amount of journalists that they've got full-time contracts within the BBC in Scotland then.
Mr Boothman and Alan.
Yeah. Mr Adam, we have regular meeting with the joint unions on a regular basis discussing the level of staffing. We had, as we indicated, the level of savings at a previous hearing that we had to make. That is due to the extra responsibilities that we have to undertake as part of the current licence fee settlement, which has been for a period of pretty much 7 years, we've frozen. We had to make savings in excess of 700 million across the organisation, and we gave full evidence to this committee about that in a previous discussion. With regard to the union, we're working with unions. We've had constructive and positive meetings with the unions, and there's an absolutely open channel. But I absolutely believe that is a matter for industrial relations between us as the BBC management and the unions and the staff.
Final point, Convener, followed. We're talking about 35 journalists possibly were let go from BBC Scotland full-time, but I've recently seen there's a job application being advertised, public policy officer, and it's between £39,000 and £62,000 a year. Now, it brings it back to my original question, which was effectively about the complaints and the level of complaints, which you said is quite more. Now, I've been led to believe that this post would actually be there to assist someone in dealing with the level of complaints of coming from the general public. Now, do you think after actually changing, you would say changing management structure, the union would probably say the cut of journalist staff at the BBC, do you think it's the right way, the right image, the right thing to put forward that, we're advertising for a job for £39,000 to £62,000 a year, that effectively someone who will just be actually dealing with complaints?
First of all, the post that you mentioned is for a 9-month period. It's a temporary post in what is a huge year for Scotland with the Commonwealth Games, with a whole number of different broadcasters. The Commonwealth Games Broadcasting Conference taking place in Glasgow and Pacific Quay in May. Referendum, whole number of other huge events in which we're heavily involved, not the least of them the centenary of World War I. I deemed it absolutely appropriate that where we have one post in that area, that we supplement that post in this year in terms of workload to ensure that the level of engagement in general between BBC Scotland and all the various bodies that we'll be engaging with is absolutely appropriate, and we're able to sustain that 7 days a week, the 52 over a 52-week period. But we adjudged that we would put in place a 9-month contract. I took the responsibility for that, having looked at all the investments we're making over increased programme output, and also over a highly successful year for BBC Scotland. And I think it's important to note that just in terms of our output, that we recorded our highest ever network television spend in Scotland the last year, with 11% of BBC network television being made in Scotland, a rise in our network TV hours of over 11%. So I took the decision on that. I take the responsibility for that post. I'm absolutely confident it's the right thing to do.
Ian MacArthur.
Thank you, Convener. Just taking you back to the report by Professor Robertson, could you perhaps indicate the number of academic reports that come to the attention of your journalists which are ignored, which don't get reported?
In terms of the number, I can put a figure on that.
Is, I think, what I'm
So are you talking, Mr MacArthur, about reports about the BBC, right?
Just general reports that are produced by academics.
There are academic reports come to the attention of the BBC and every broadcasting and journalistic organisation all the time. The reporting of them is a matter of editorial judgment, a matter of news values. So that's a... Yeah.
It's fair to say that a large proportion are simply ignored because they don't meet those criteria.
Yeah.
And as part of those criteria, I think this is probably what you were alluding to there, is there a tendency amongst BBC journalists not to report academic studies where they believe the methodology is flawed or that there is inaccuracies in it, whether to do with the BBC or whether it's to do with any other area of policy? Would that be part of the editorial judgment that's made?
Journalists would make that kind of assessment. You know, what is the methodology in the report? Is the report accurate or otherwise? What techniques have been used in terms of the completion of the report? Are there any errors in the report? What are the conclusions of the report? People would make that assessment before determining whether or not at the end of the day they were going to cover such a report, and that happens on a day and daily basis.
And is it your impression, and can you perhaps evidence this, that the BBC has a reasonable reputation? I think there's always room for improvement. Does it have a reasonable reputation for self-criticism and self-analysis?
I think so, yeah.
Is there any evidence that you can provide to substantiate that?
When in our normal editorial processes, as I've explained each and every day on each and every story, there are editorial guidelines to be taken into account. Discussions take place day and daily throughout the day, as in any other...
But when stories are about the BBC, does the BBC, in your opinion, and can you perhaps evidence this, does the BBC take a fairly robust line in being self-critical?
I think over the past few months there have been many stories about the BBC, and I think the BBC has proved in recent times up to reporting these stories in a fair and impartial manner. In relation to Professor Robertson's report, I was interested in some of the things he had to say earlier. The report was discussed on phone-in programmes. I certainly heard it, and Mr Robertson was interviewed in Good Morning Scotland.
And in terms of the issue of complaints. I mean, obviously, I've listened with interest to the exchanges with George Adam and also with the convener, although there does appear to be a bit of an inconsistency in the approach there. But in relation to complaints, inevitably, I think in the run-up to the referendum, you would anticipate a closer scrutiny and therefore probably a greater interest in complaining. Have you any way of analysing whether those complaints come from those with a particular agenda to prosecute, or whether they just come from members of the public who are regular listeners or viewers who, it just so happens, are affronted or simply have misgivings about the way in which BBC programming has been conducted?
I think our desire is, and our practice, to respond to each and every complaint on an equivalent basis, no matter what that complaint, and that's our intention, and that's what we're set up to do, and then to make it clear to the complainants what the next steps that are available to them in terms of the complaints process that if necessary to go through to the BBC Trust.
Presumably you will separate out those that are coming, for example, from the press offices of the respective political parties, or those that are associated with the respective campaigns on the referendum, from those that are coming from people who don't have an obvious tie in either of those respects. Is that?
If a complaint comes from if you like, political offices, and it's a formal complaint, it gets absolutely treated in the same way. It gets treated with absolutely the care you would expect. And if it's an informal complaint, which sometimes happens, then usually a dialogue engages with the senior staff responsible for that editorial output. So the complaints can come in a variety of forms, but if they're a written complaint and it's a formal complaint, it has to go within our complaints process.
And just the last two brief points. Have you got any sense of campaigns where complaints appear to be orchestrated? I mean, we all are subjected to letter-writing campaigns and email campaigns where it's obvious that the wording that is used reflects a concerted campaign, which is entirely legitimate. Do you get sight of that? Is there a way of distinguishing between sort of campaigns, if you like, and a spontaneous outburst of anxiety about certain programming? And also, do you have a sense, even if you can't give us the numbers of complaints, about whether or not they fall equally on either side of the debate in relation to the referendum?
In terms of the complaints, whatever view we take of the genesis of a complaint, we make sure that we treat each and every one with equivalence and respond equally to whatever complaint, irrespective of whether it might be part of a campaign or not.
And in terms of whether they fall either side of the referendum debate?
It's immaterial to us, right? At the end of the day, if a member of the audience complains, we will deal appropriately with the complaint. I mean, look, it's fair to say, right?
I mean, this is more in the context of the evidence we heard in the first panel from Professor Robertson, in a sense. Would lead you to believe that more likely you're going to get complaints from those on the yes side of the...
Well, I don't necessarily... I don't necessarily support that particular point of view. It depends, over a period of time, depending on what happens in the campaign, you will get complaints from one side or the other. From our point of view, we don't distinguish between them in that we will deal with each and every individual complaint. What I can say, as I've said already, is that, yeah, there's been an increase in the number of complaints. I indicated the two areas that where those had come from, and to be honest, I'm anticipating over the next 6.5 months there's going to be an even bigger number of complaints. But part of it depends, at the end of the day, about the issue. Part of it, that's where it is.
I should have declared an interest as a family member who works for the BBC. Apologies.
Thank you. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. I've got a quick supplementary on George Adams' line of questioning, first of all. I'm still a little bit confused, sorry. From the cost-cutting exercise last year, the efficiency savings, my understanding is that 35 journalism posts were cut. Is that correct?
In the 2-year period up until April 2013, the Department of News and Current Affairs and BBC Scotland lost up to 30 members of staff. Those staff were not all journalists. They came from a variety of different parts of the country. A couple of those staff, for example, were content assistant. 3 of those staff were content assistant, which is a grade below that of a researcher. 2 of those staff were resources staff, staff who are around cameras and editing, and most of them, to be fair, Ms Adamson, were journalistic staff. They were not all in Glasgow. They came from a variety of places around the country, and by far the vast majority of them were voluntary redundancies.
Thank you. Mr Boothman, you mentioned 2 high-profile women journalists, glad to say, that have been appointed. Out of those 50 staff in the referendum unit, can you tell us how many are in journalism posts?
John, most of them, I think.
You mean seconded from other places?
No, you said there were 50 staff members in the referendum unit.
Oh, you mean are they working as journalists?
Yes.
Yes. Well, you have 14 trainees, and then the others are all working as journalists. Yeah.
So they're all journalism?
There's a production manager and there's an assistant production manager, and there's one researcher.
Yeah, I don't want to. Would it be possible for you to
basically, yes,
they're all the breakdown of the structure of that unit?
All directly related to output, if you like, in terms of getting programming and production on the air.
Okay, thank you. That would be very helpful if that could be provided. If I could now go on to my own question, Convener. I don't know if you were able to view the previous evidence session, but I did ask Professor quite specifically about the methodology that had been used in his research, and he assured us that it was a grounded theory that had been used in other academic studies. But I think in your opening statement, Mr Macquarie, you questioned that methodology. Is that correct? You have concerns about the methodology?
We had concerns over how stories were categorised, if you like, and these were essentially errors of fact, which is contained in the document that we produced. I'm not in terms of the key thing for us is to get the factual base correct. It's up to Professor Robertson to apply whatever methodology that he wishes, but if that methodology is not on a sound factual base, then it's incumbent on us to try and help Professor Robertson by pointing out where we believe there to be errors of fact.
I mean, one of the things that we found interesting about this exercise is, having listened at great length this morning to the report's author, I'm not really sure which report we're talking about. Are we talking about the original report that he published in January, which remains this morning on the University of Scotland website, or are we talking about the amended report that he submitted to the committee that we saw for the first time last week? Fundamentally, one of the issues that did concern us has already been touched on briefly by Mr Macquarie, which was the initial report said that it had examined weekday evenings on 2 channels for 4 programmes, an hour each. Now, it's no mean feat to watch, transcribe and code that much of television, and I'm sure the committee will be aware of that. But let me say that the amended report told us that he had studied 640 hours of programme, which is 110 hours less than the initial estimate in January, but yet, for the first time, the report suggested that the report was not only looking at weekday evenings on 4 programmes and 2 channels, but was including all of the weekend bulletins. Now, the curiosity for us was that not a single figure in each of the 17 categories identified in the report had been changed. So a number of bulletins across 2 days for a whole year on, as I say, 4 programmes and 2 channels had been analysed, yet there was no difference in any of the numerical analysis that's in the report. Other things just... We've provided an analysis of the report, and to be fair, the Professor has corrected a number of incidences in it. For example, there were some quite glaring things. Ruth Davidson and Willie Rennie were confused. One of the examples has been changed, another one has not been changed. For each example in Reporting Scotland that the report identified, there were either factual errors about the date, people who were named as taking part in the reports didn't take part, the end summary, what we call the payoffs of the report, were not actually the payoffs that are identified in the report, were not the payoffs that actually were either said by the reporters or included in the reports. There are a number of factual errors in the report. The other difficulty, to be fair, that we had with the report, and again we sent all of these observations privately to the report's author in January, were the classifications in the report. I heard, for example, Mr MacArthur ask a question this morning in relation to 2 subjects. One, that a health story was mentioned in the report, which was under the current devolution settlement and nothing to do with referendum coverage. I don't know why that should be in the report if it's about referendum coverage. And in relation to a question you asked about the former Auditor General Robert Black, which was about the affordability of free care for the elderly and prescription charges under the current devolution settlement. Now, there may be a rational explanation for this, right? Fair enough. But to be fair, these were what we thought were not minor concerns in the report, but some fairly significant and major concerns. And we welcome any report, convener, of this kind of nature. It's important that we talk about these things, and we are happy to do so.
Thank you. Claire.
Just finally, Mr McCorry, in your opening statement in discussing the report, I think you said that you were concerned about the allegations in the report. Having read it myself, I'm not aware of any allegations. I'm only aware of observations in it. Could you clarify what you meant by that statement?
I think that in terms of the report, suggests, for example, that there is what you might call a lazy approach, to our journalism, and I think we refute that.
Thank you very much. Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. Can I first of all say it's a pleasure to interview the BBC? Can I first of all talk about... sorry, I've got so much written down here. Obviously, throughout Scotland just now, there's pro-independence, there's pro-Scotland remaining in the United Kingdom, and there's a huge amount of people who are still undecided. If the examples in Professor Robertson's research points out some of the risks and uncertainties, now Professor Robertson appears to see, by the fact that you're highlighting these risks and uncertainties, they seem to be taken as somehow a criticism of the Yes campaign. From where I'm coming from, you're actually reflecting reality, because people across Scotland do want to know what happens in the result of a Yes vote. How did you feel about looking at the examples of risks and uncertainties being defined as a criticism? I mean, I would hope that that is part of the job that you will do for the next 6 months, is to highlight and debate these risks.
This important debate, our desire is to provide the most impartial coverage that we possibly can, and that ultimately is a matter of editorial judgment for our highly experienced journalists. And they do that on a daily basis, and that doesn't mean simply between one side or another, but trying to get the whole spectrum and the range of views that are alive within this debate. So our job is to report the news as it happens, to make judgments on that. Professor Robertson, deals with issues of which story comes first and which comes last, which is some currency within some academic theories, but it's not something that we recognise within as a measure of impartiality within our output. And our desire is quite simply every day to bring, first of all, the most comprehensive coverage to the audience in Scotland, to be absolutely impartial in bringing that coverage to air, and also to provide, in terms of the quality of journalism and broadcasting, to aspire to the highest standard possible. And every day we look at that, question ourselves on how well we did the previous day. On a monthly basis, I chair a formal group across the whole of the BBC where, on an issue like the referendum, we will discuss and debate all the stories, how we treated them. And we're absolutely conscious that there are times with the volume of journalism that we are doing, occasionally we may get it wrong, and it's important when we do so, we'll put our hands up and admit that to be the case, and on other occasions then the BBC Trust may take a view of what we broadcast. But that is deep in the DNA of every journalist in BBC Scotland, to absolutely bring the very best of our journalism to this story. That's our aspiration, and I believe that in some of the examples that we can give of the programming that we've done, that we can substantiate and answer the question that the convener posed to us in coming here today, which was to study the level of preparedness for two major events, the referendum and the Commonwealth Games. And I think properly, I think the committee deemed it important to spend time on Professor Robertson's report, but it was only last week that we knew that Professor Robertson was coming to the committee, and we had, but our main focus... Yeah.
It's very interesting, but given the time, could we keep the answers a little bit shorter so a lot of members still want to come in?
But thank you, Convener. But our main focus is in delivering the best on these two events and trying to answer and assure the committee of our level of preparedness for them.
Yes, thank you. I certainly would hope, because I think people are looking to you and other sources of media for answers on pensions, banks, currency in Europe. My second question is, you say that Professor Black singularly failed to define fairness. Now, you've helpfully given us the definition of fairness as defined by Ofcom. Could you just explain how Professor Robertson's definition of fairness, if you like, how did that differ? How does it differ from yours, or the one set out by Ofcom?
Well, I think we were simply trying to understand from Professor Robertson how he defined fairness, if you like, in that regard, and we wanted to engage in a dialogue with Professor Robertson, on that, but he, in terms of the data, or how he defined it, he was unwilling to do so in that regard.
Okay, my final question, Convener. As the Deputy Convener of the Audit Committee, I did find the comments about the Auditor General. Every report is critical in some way because it has to be critical. They're looking at public sector spending and value for money. I would hope...
Just for accuracy,
yeah.
And this is the point I was trying to raise earlier, I'm sorry I have to interrupt here, but my understanding is that he was not the Auditor General at the time. He was commenting as an individual. He was the former Auditor General, so to try and suggest it was a report by Auditor General is inaccurate, Mary.
well, he was 13 years a highly respected Auditor General in this Parliament, and I would certainly hope that that office doesn't come under criticism. Can I just finally say, given that we've already had an SNP minister writing to an academic institution to complain about a researcher there, Chris Watley, how can we move forward with a fair, highly informed, just and reasonable debate, given, you know, what is at stake here in the next 6 months? And can I also put on record that I'm aware that some of your complaints have come from some Tory members who think that you're too biased in favour of independence. So whatever complaints you have, they're not all coming from one side.
Well, looking forward, we will be publishing our referendum guidelines, which are awaiting final approval by the BBC Trust. They've been for consultation, and it will be absolutely clear in terms of these guidelines. But to say that, I think this is a debate where impartiality is much more than a simple balance of appearances by members of one or other campaign. The objective is to achieve what the draft guidelines will call a broad balance between the arguments in this debate. And that will include, you know, a range of voices. Our editorial guidelines are very clear that we must ensure that news judgments continue to drive editorial decision-making in news-based programmes. And in other words, we will cover what's happening whilst making sure that the bar for impartiality is high.
To inform and to be part of that debate.
Lots of members who want to come in this morning, so I really want to try and get through them. Joan McAlpine.
Thank you very much, Convener. If I could go back to Professor Robertson's results, notwithstanding the issues that you've raised about the types of programme covered, because you're in dispute about the hours and so on, I'll just stick to his figures on Reporting Scotland for the interest of clarity. Now, in terms of overall statements of a pro-independence nature and an anti-independence nature, he found that there were 171 statements of a pro-independence nature recorded and 262 of an anti-independence nature. Now, if you watched his evidence this morning, he said he wasn't too concerned about it because he felt it could be explained in the fact that you have to interview the three better together parties, and so therefore that is going to introduce an imbalance. And I know that that imbalance has been addressed in your referendum debate coverage, but is there a difficulty in addressing that imbalance when you're reporting news?
Yeah, I think we've moving into a new phase of the campaign. Certainly through the designated period, we would always have a broad balance of views between the arguments, the yes and the no. But we've really been operating that really for a long time now, certainly since last September, I would say. So in any one issue, whenever there's a debate, there should be a broad balance of arguments between yes and no, and that's the approach we'll take.
In terms of a news story, and particularly say something coming out of the Parliament, for example, would you find a conflict in terms of balancing between the different parties and balancing between yes and no?
There's not so much of a conflict when it's Holyrood. I can see that there is a conflict when it's Westminster, and particularly we had Ian Lang's debate in the House of Lords, and obviously it's hard to find SNP peers to appear in a programme like that. So what we did was we had an SNP spokesperson on the next day, or a Scottish Government spokesperson on the next day, I can't quite remember, and that was a way of balancing up the argument in that.
Could you see, that what I'm driving at is that you've got a commitment to impartiality. Could you see a conflict between the commitment to impartiality between 50-50 yes, no, and between a balance of three better together parties? And
I think there is a conflict there, but the way we're resolving the conflict is always to go for the balance.
Right. So will your referendum guidelines that you say you're about to publish, will they address that specifically? Right, okay, thanks very much. Yeah.
Can I give you an interesting example, right, which is really to say that, you know, a simple mathematical formula and a stopwatch doesn't always address this, right? In the last month, when the Chancellor of Exchequer made an intervention in relation to the currency, Henry McLeish, who is a no supporter, made an argument which said it could be argued was supported the views of the other side of the debate. If you were looking at that in a purely 50-50 way, right, rather than just introducing a range of views to the debate, where would you put him in terms of a categorisation like the professors? The same might apply on the other side of the debate with, let's say, the monarchy. If you were to go and interview Dennis Canavan or the Greens, who take a different view, from the SNP, for example, where would you categorise them? This is a complex issue. Right. At the end of the day, though, what the BBC attempts to do is to reflect a range of views across the debate, and that's the way we'll inform our audiences.
What I picked up from what you said a few minutes ago is that going forward, your referendum guidelines would be much more focused on the 50-50 between yes and no, notwithstanding there's a range of opinions within that.
I think at the end of the day that as the referendum gets closer, of course we will pay much more attention to that. There's different periods in the year in different circumstances where almost different broad balance would apply. For example, during the year of the professor study, there was a by-election in Aberdeen Donside. If we were reporting a referendum issue during that by-election, then we would have to report what all of the parties said, and that might include the Greens, it might include other parties as well as the four main parties who were standing. That once we get closer to the referendum, though, these things will be focused. That is not to say that we face particular challenges, for example, during the forthcoming European elections.
Moving on to another aspect of Professor Robertson's findings, he looked at the personalisation of independence as Alex Salmond's idea. And in reporting Scotland, he found 28 examples of that, compared to no examples of personalisation of ideas as from better together individuals. Now, notwithstanding what you've said about, figures, and you have some issues with Professor Robertson's figures, that would seem to me to have no margin of error in it at all. You've got, 28 versus 0, and I wondered if that was something that gave you cause for concern.
Tell you what I did, right, because I had a pet theory of my own about this. I looked at the period that, the weekend that Professor Robertson had studied between September the 17th, he says, 2012 and September the 18th, 2013. And I looked at Thursdays, because on Thursdays, the fulcrum of democratic debate in this institution is, of course, First Minister's questions, which by and large in both BBC and STV are reported fairly frequently. And it's very, very, very difficult not to report verbatim what party leaders say in First Minister's questions. That would be partially my simple explanation for what Professor Robertson refers to as the personalisation and possibly the demonisation. I think there might be a much simpler reason.
One day a week you're looking at one specific day, whereas he was very clear that he didn't take samples. He looked at every single programme in that period. Well,
I asked this morning, funnily enough, of my colleagues in our office in the Parliament. I think they told me that there are 37 First Minister's questions a year, or 36, and the number referred to by Professor Robertson is kind of about that, but he did examine two programmes that are Scottish-based in Scotland, and we don't cover First Minister's questions and Reporting Scotland every week. But look, I'm not saying that that is the complete answer, Ms McAlpine, but I think it's a reasonable theory to suggest.
What about the complete lack of personalisation of pro-UK ideas to any personality in the unionist side?
Well, I'm not necessarily sure that I accept the analysis, to be honest, but what I can do is explain, as I have, right, what I think has happened in terms of the reporting of this particular part of the campaign. I mean, we report First Minister's questions, we report what the First Minister might say, what other party leaders might say, and that would explain why there was a big number of instances where those individuals were being directly referred to in programmes.
To you, in terms of the media landscape around the referendum out with the BBC, there are a number of newspapers that, you know, have nailed their colours very firmly to the mast and are very virulently, say, anti-independence. Say, for example, a paper like the Daily Mail, they would regularly use independence as the personal views of Mr Salmond on their front page, as indeed do some other newspapers. Do you think that perhaps your BBC journalists are influenced by that media landscape more generally?
Not particularly, no. I don't really know where to take that question, to be honest. You know,
obviously, these newspapers don't have any obligation to impartiality, whereas the BBC does.
Of course, but we've talked about 28 instances that you've cited and 36 FMQs. Doesn't take too much to work out that 28 is fewer than 36, so it seems to me to be quite a reasonable...
I'll interrupt again, but I'm pretty sure that Joan McCarthy did not say that she was citing 20 instances out of 36 FMQs.
No, I didn't.
No, we cited the 36 FMQs.
But you don't cover every FMQs as
no, but 28 is less than 36, so
yeah,
we can regard that it's a fair proportion.
Yeah, but there are absolutely no examples of the personalisation of ideas to better together individuals, and he's actually broadened that out to other individuals as opposed to one individual.
Just to come to your question, Mr McAlpin, are our journalists influenced by other media who take a particular line in the debate? My view and strong belief is that because of the level of training, the integrity, the probity and the professionalism of our journalists, that is absolutely not the case.
Just one final question.
I'm going to have to move on. We've got a number of people, but I just want to myself ask a couple of quick questions following on from that. Excluding FMQs, are you suggesting that it's only FMQs where the personalisation takes place?
No, I'm saying that part of the explanation, as I said earlier, perhaps could be, right, when programmes focus on what the leaders say in the chamber, right, would be the fact that, you know, the fulcrum of democratic debate in the Scottish Parliament on a weekly basis is First Minister's questions. And having looked, as I said, right, at Thursdays in Reporting Scotland in particular over the last year, I found a number of reports, right? I think 14 of them in Reporting Scotland alone, and that obviously doesn't include what would have been on STV, where the First Minister featured heavily, not necessarily, you know, as the lead person in a report or whatever, but, you know, at the end of the day, it provided for me some explanation, right, of what the professor had an alternative theory for.
Having looked at it, it doesn't seem to me that explains it at all. It's the personalisation of ideas as Alex Salmond's or as better together individuals. It's not about, you know, the First Minister at FMQs today said this and the leader of the Labour Party said that, or the leader of the Conservatives said something else. That isn't what this is about. This is about, for example, on any other subjects, for example, the currency union idea, that it's Alex Salmond's idea as opposed to the view of Yes Scotland, or vice versa, the views of Better Together being expressed as the views of Better Together rather than the views of Alistair Darling.
Many of the exchanges in the First Minister's questions over the period that are referred to in the report were about the referendum, to be honest. I have not been subject party to the data set that the Professor used in his analysis, and that's something that when we originally corresponded with him, we were looking for.
I meant to mention this earlier. I find that very interesting. It is your output. You have the original data.
Which is why I had to look at it.
So you just said you don't have access to it.
I don't have access to what the Professor has or has not included in his report, is what I'm saying. I mean, I've already pointed out, for example, in terms of his categories and his classifications, I don't understand at all why, for example, health stories may be included in it. I don't understand, as I've said, for example, why the report that we've been talking about by the former Auditor General would be included in it. At the end of the day, until we have some opportunity to take a look at what was included in the report and what was not included, what I'm saying to you, right, is that in terms of First Minister's questions and in terms of the suggestion, the theory, the hypothesis that the Professor has, partly explaining what he regards as the personalisation and demonisation of the First Minister can be explained simply by the number of reports at First Minister's questions that dealt with issues around the referendum debate. That's my reading of it, given the simple level of knowledge that I had of what he studied.
I don't think it says demonisation, I think it says personalisation, which is
I think you will find that the report refers to demonisation.
In terms of the categories, Mr Boothman, in terms of the category is the personalisation of ideas as one or the other.
Well, as I say, he refers to demonisation in the body of the report and talks about Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock, and the same thing happening to the First Minister has happened to them.
Okay, let's look at the very briefly. And I mentioned this, I asked Professor Robertson the same question. Across all of the categories in his research, where there's a direct comparison between the two sides, like the one we've just been discussing, in all cases, there's a huge majority on one side against the other. For example, the ones that John McAlpine mentioned earlier, pro-independence 211, this is across Reporting Scotland and BBC, anti-independence 317, finishing with pro-evidence unchallenged 10, finishing with anti-evidence unchallenged 40, abuse of pro-independence figures 19, abuse of anti-independence figures 3, plus all the other ones that are listed in the report and John McAlpine mentioned earlier. Is it possible that over a 12-month period, an organisation that states that its primary purpose is to provide balance in this debate could end up with a set of figures that look like that?
I think in terms of the Professor places a lot of weight on the order, what you call unchallenged, if you like. If you end with one side or the other, he places a lot. We don't recognise that as being important. We recognise the narrative of the story, the clarity of the narrative, and the impartiality within a report as the clear issue. The Professor believes academically that order is important. It doesn't form part of the criteria to which we subscribe. In terms of the question, until we have access to the raw data in the way that the Professor is codifying and categorising, it's difficult to respond to that question, Mr Convener, which is why we've politely asked the Professor to make available the raw data.
But it's almost impossible to believe that, given the randomness of ordering, if you don't take any particular view or stance on the ordering of the stories, that it would be impossible for it to come out in the way that it has in terms of the research.
I disagree with that, because that depends on how the stories are categorised and how they're codified. And without the evidence of that raw data as to how these numbers are made up and examining them, we've found, on the examples given, we've found a number of errors. We've listed these errors before in our paper to Professor Robertson.
And list an error, a typographical error, as a substantial error in the report.
Sorry, what's the typical
the misnaming of the person who said it as Joanne Lamont versus
sorry,
Davidson.
Sorry, Convener. I don't. Well, this happened twice in the original report. That Willie Rennie was confused in the space of 3 lines with Ruth Davidson. And in the draft second report,
that change what was said?
If you'd forgive me, in the draft second report, one of those errors has been corrected and one of them hasn't, despite the fact that we pointed this out to the author in January.
Error, is it?
Well, I would have thought most people would know the difference between Ruth Davidson and Willie Rennie, to be honest, right? But if we've pointed it out, and it's very, very easy simply to go and check, there also was
in what way, Mr Boothman, does that affect the figures?
Well, if as I've said, each and every example reported from Reporting Scotland has an error of fact, an error of inclusion, an error of omission, or an error in terms of how the author describes who was in it, or an error in the payoff to the report, and that's in each and every example, it makes it difficult and is of some concern to us that the numbers that might be in the report can be entirely correct. It's also fair to say, if the Professor says, as he said this morning, that he didn't just do samples of programmes, he surveyed the whole domain, yet but in the space of a month, that domain changes from 2 hours every night to 2 hours every night plus a load of bulletins in 4 programmes in 2 channels over the weekend, that the number of hours he surveyed strangely seems to have dropped as a result of that and not gone up. It makes it quite difficult and quite concerning for us when we're looking at it.
Is there anything at all that you accept from Professor Robertson's report?
As I said to you, it's a remarkable feat that a report could be watched, transcribed and coded for an entire year for this amount of work. There is nothing else the BBC can do in relation to this but to respond appropriately to it, and that's what we feel we did. Right? At the end of the day, it would be remiss of us when reports like this come out not to respond to them in order that, well, our audiences, for a start, might have some perspective on it. There's no malice in that. There is no attack on the author in that. That's not something we would do. Despite what may have been said, at the end of the day, we wanted to deal substantially with the issues in the report, and I think we've done that in as fair and as reasonable and as prompt way as possible.
Mr. Robertson doesn't feel that. Sorry, Professor Robertson doesn't feel that at all. He feels he's been under personal attack from members of the BBC staff. He feels that he is being abused by the BBC. I think it was quite clear in his view of that this morning. You yourself have said that there has been no other instance that you're aware of that you've ever analysed and written to a person's employer about their work. It does seem, on the face of it, slightly odd.
We haven't written to the employer. What we've done is copied the principal on a report that was on the University of the West of Scotland, which I'm sure he would be absolutely aware of. So we're not providing the principal with any new news, as far as that's concerned. And it's with some puzzlement that we hear Professor Robertson's feelings in regard to the way that he was treated, because I've examined the language of the emails, I've examined the emails, and there is nothing other than a polite and normal request for the data.
Thanks, Convener. I just wanted to ask you about, you mentioned in your evidence a lot about the debates that the BBC are holding. We heard some concerns recently about the adversarial nature of the last STV debate and the format of that. Have you received any positive, negative feedback about the style of the BBC debates, and do you have any plans to alter the format of the BBC debates?
So, just briefly before I pass to my colleague, Mr Mullen, one of the things in a campaign that's this long, from the BBC's point of view, in terms of engaging our audience, is to try as much as possible to use different formats. So that we can keep the audience engaged, we can keep up interest in the story, we can pick up new people who are coming along, we can target different segments of the electorate who are going to be voting in this referendum, and that's been one of our objectives from the very beginning. We've had audiences, for example, of people from different ethnic minority backgrounds in Scotland. We've had audiences of women. We are going to various parts of the country. We've had audiences of of 16 and 17-year-olds. We are trying some new and interesting formats. Many of you may have seen, for example, a couple of debates that we've ran with 3 journalists questioning 2 politicians, which has been interesting for us because it changes the dynamic of the politicians' responses. It actually, I think, gives a politician a better opportunity to explain where they are. But Mr Mullen might be able to enlighten you further about some of the other things that we're planning and doing.
Completely stolen my thunder there, John. Thank you very much. Okay, so we started our series of 9 debates. You'll have seen that we were in Greenock, first of all, and in Kelso last month. The aim really is, one of the crucial things I feel is to get out of the Central Belt. So Kelso last month, there will be Kirkcaldy next week, and then we're off to your backyard, Mr MacArthur, and Kirkwall. We will vary these debates. They've been produced by Mentor and the Indie outfit who make question time, but we will change these as we go along. We haven't finalised our approach to all of these, nor the venues, but we want to bring a bit of spontaneity to those as we go along. We're also having an online debate next week with the Generation 2014 group that's been brought together with my colleague David Stenhouse. They're the 50, 16 and 17-year-olds from all over Scotland who will be brought together in Pacific Quay next week for that. And they're a resource that right across BBC Network many programmes are making use of. We've got Brian Taylor's big debate continues its way around the country every Friday in Radio Scotland, and we'll also be initiating a series of specific local debates, radio debates, presented by our own correspondents, David Gray in Orkney, Cameron Buttle down in Borders, etc. And each month we earmark one day for a special edition of Newsnight, which have allowed for the Taylor debates that John's already mentioned. This programming and the debates will also be mirrored on BBC Alba and on Radio Nan Gale. You might be interested in the BBC Scotland's Knowledge and Learning Department is also planning a range of these operations. So, debate and getting people talking and coming up with new ideas for programmes, very much part and parcel of what we want to do over the next 6 months. We want to get out from the Central Belt. We want to get around the country. We want to give viewers and listeners a chance to put the questions that they think are important, both nationally and locally, to the politicians, the campaigners, and the key personalities in the campaign. And, it's a very ambitious programme. I don't think any other broadcaster is doing it, but we look forward to generating more light onto the debate than heat over the next few months.
Thanks for that. We've obviously talked a lot this morning about balance in news coverage. I wanted to ask you about balance in debates. And after the last STV debate, I was struck by a commentator who said it was his perception that if the debate was a football match, that one of the speakers had 60% possession to 40%. Where there's 2 speakers and 2 on either side of the debate in these television debates, what do you do to ensure that you monitor that there's equal say of people when there's 2 candidates on these TV debates? Is that something you monitor? Is that something you look at?
It's good chairing, and we've got a good chair. James Cook, our Scotland correspondent, is proven exceptional at that. We've gone back and looked at the programmes afterwards, and we feel there was absolutely a broad balance in both programmes between the yes and the no arguments. And that's exactly what we will do for every debate that we have, a broad balance between the yes and the no arguments.
Okay, Liam MacArthur.
Very much. Could I maybe just take you back to the issue of the personalisation? And obviously, Professor Robertson's report has provided statistics about which there can be no ambiguity in terms of the personalisation of better together individuals at 0. Over the course of the year of watching Reporting Scotland on a Thursday evening, did you establish how many references there were to either David Cameron or George Osborne or Nick Clegg bearing in mind that the attack, if you like, of the Yes campaign has not been largely about Alistair Darling, but about portraying it as something to do with Eton-educated Tories in the south of England. Would you be able to reflect on whether this came across in the period from 2012?
To be honest, it wasn't something, Mr MacArthur, that I looked at. I mean, there was a specific point made in relation to the report in the body of the report directly about the personalisation round about the First Minister, and that was the thing I was looking for, to be honest.
Right, but would it surprise you if there were zero references to either the Prime Minister or the Chancellor over the period from September 2012 to 2013?
I don't really know the answer to that question.
Interesting. Colin Beattie.
Convener, reference was made before about funding of £5 million, and I assume that is 100% dedicated to the referendum. Have you got a published plan as to how that money is going to be spent?
We have an internal plan as to how that money is spent, which will be subject to both our internal audit and post a review of how we're spending the money, and each month we review our spend across the various criteria and targets that we have for delivering the referendum programming. We don't publish individual programme budgets because we've at previous sessions, when we've been asked to do so here, whether on Good Morning Scotland or the Today programme, we have consistently refused to go into individual programme budgets. But yes, we do. To answer your question, Mr Beattie, which I think is at the thrust of your question, do we monitor and do we have a system of a rigorous scrutiny of how that money is spent? Absolutely.
So can I say something, Mr Beattie, in that one of the things that we've had to do to this point is spend an awful long time, and actually, to be fair, this has been a much bigger job for my colleague, Mr Malcolm, in terms of the Commonwealth Games, is capacity building for this. That is to say, programme planning, identifying which programmes we're going to do, working out how many staff we'll need for them, what are the technical resources that we need in order to make that happen, and we've done a lot of that. It may be of interest to the committee to note that one of the big things that we've spent a very long time doing in the past couple of months is preparing for what, given this is the biggest political story that's never ever happened in the country, is preparing for the results service and the results programming around this. We are going to be in up to 40 live locations round about Scotland. We will take reaction from other parts of the UK and reaction from all around the globe, and this is going to be the biggest news and current affairs set-up that we've ever had on a single day in the country, and I can tell you that that does take a lot of planning, so we've been spending a lot of time doing that. It would also be remiss of me to mention, because part of it's happening now, is that in the past few months we've been involved in quite a lot of liaison, not just with our network colleagues, but with our colleagues, for example, in the World Service. Right at this very moment, the John Beattie programme is broadcasting to Scotland and to the rest of the world in English in the BBC World Service, and that's the first of many programmes. There's a television programme being recorded for the World Service round about that. This afternoon, the World Service Arabic Service is making a live radio programme for radio and television, so that the debate about Scotland's future is going to be broadcast around the whole of the Middle East. That programme, the producers tell me, has got a particular focus on how in Scotland this debate is being carried out in the civilised manner that it is.
£5 million doesn't seem a lot for all to achieve all that.
In Scotland, to be fair, there have been additional resources made available to our colleagues in London, and aside from that, you have to remember that we have lots of capacity in the BBC in Scotland in using current affairs already, and a considerable amount of our existing programming will be turned over to the coverage not just of the Commonwealth Games but of the referendum.
So are there specific budgets allocated outside Scotland? Do we know how much they are?
Not from the £5 million.
Not referring to £5 million. Are there separate budgets outside Scotland?
In general terms, that departments across the BBC, for example, BBC News, have budgets for major events, major broadcasts, and to some extent have made provision, to a large extent have made provision for the coverage of the referendum within their plan and within their budget. And that is also true in terms of television, where there are various supportive documentaries being made, for the network. And I think one of the questions that the committee wished to ask us, was not only our level of preparedness for the events of the referendum and the Commonwealth Games, but our ability to maintain, if you like, business as usual while these two events were going on. And I can report to the committee that we have had a hugely successful year, and I'm absolutely proud of the achievements, particularly the achievements of all our staff in delivering the quality of programming that they've done so in this year. And it's just worth noting, just to put in the record, that we have 7 BAFTA Scotland Awards and a particular recognition for our investigations team, who got a Scottish BAFTA and twice the Royal Television Society Award for Investigative Journalism, which is very rare to get it 2 years in a row. All of that was taking place while at the same time planning and putting in place the capacity for the Commonwealth Games and the referendum. And I'm intensely proud of the achievements of our staff in doing that, and intensely proud of our journalism and the quality of journalism that we brought, for example, to the tragedy of the Clutha Vaults, where the journalists responded tremendously, but not only on radio and television, but on online, where we saw record figures, over the past year in terms of the use of our online services. And I think it's important to put that on the record. Whatever the disagreements that we would sit down within an internal meeting of how I've implemented the DQF savings, as they're known, between myself and the NUJ, it's important to put in the record my regard and pride in the quality of the journalism that we brought not only to Scotland, but to the world.
Within the budget of the budget of £5 million, you've obviously said that you've already recruited 50 staff. Now, am I right in saying that 14 of these staff are trainees?
That's correct, yes.
Now, these trainees, are they all working full-time on the referendum?
Yes.
They are. Now, my understanding was that some of the referendum trainees were actually diverted to doing research on the report we've been talking about by Professor Robertson. Would that be correct? I heard there was 5 of them were working on that.
I think that is correct. I think the five were used to investigate some of the examples that Professor Robertson had looked at.
So they are being used for other things as well?
Well, you could argue that's referendum-related coverage, couldn't you, since it seems to be about referendum coverage that Professor Robertson's relating his report. But they are working in the referendum. They've, as I say, an intensive training period of 3 months, and then they're working on other programmes and other output across the...
When does the 3-month training finish?
Well, the 3 months is ongoing over the first 3 or 4 months they're there, so they've still got a week or so to go.
Sorry, Mr. Beattie, if I can explain this, right, what happened was we created these positions, right, for a year, which were 14 trainees positions in BBC Scotland. We spoke to the College of Journalism, which part of the BBC Training Academy, and what they've done is they have organised for us a gold standard training scheme across all our platforms. So almost as part of a kind of block release programme at the same time as the trainees are working on referendum programming, they've undergone periods of training. For example, they finished a week-long period of television training, I think the week before last, and before that, in November, they had online training, and before that, they had radio training. So we reckon that they are in a place now where, in terms of any of the output across the whole of the department, that they can be deployed round about, whether that be in terms of our online coverage, in terms of any radio programmes we've got in the forthcoming months, for example, and I've not had a chance to mention these new radio formats coming up. Scotland 2014 I've mentioned. There is a rich variety of work on online that I'm sure John could tell us more about. All of these trainees, as far as I'm concerned, are now in a pretty good place in relation to being able to carry out the tasks across the department that we would require them to do over the referendum. It's worth, and sorry, I didn't have an opportunity of saying this earlier, one of the interesting things about the length of this campaign and when the referendum actually is that for the first time over the summer period, BBC Scotland will be keeping on all of our political output. Now, part of that is a response to the fact that the Parliament itself has changed its timetable. But you'll be aware, in terms of political programming, what usually happens is when the Parliament goes into the long summer recess, all of the political programmes go off and don't come back to the beginning of the party conference season in late September. We won't be doing this year. So as well as all of the additional output that we've spoken about, we are going to keep going with all our political programmes. That's why the points I was making earlier on in terms of engagement with our audience are so important in terms of us having the opportunity to do new things, new formats, to surprise people, frankly. And that's one of the things that's our objectives in terms of our coverage, because at the end of the day, if we use the same old formats and the same old programmes, we hope we won't turn off audiences.
We're also investing in a number of craft apprentices, Mr. Beattie, who will obviously hugely necessary in delivering the output, in addition for apprentices with the Commonwealth Games, which with the other event that you asked us to give assurance on and our level of preparedness, which we have Bruce Malcolm, our head of the Commonwealth Games, here, should you wish to, any questions on that regard.
So, I've got one final question, actually, which is, I suppose, relates to what, there's been criticism of what you have reported by some people, and there's also been criticism of what you don't report. Which is always a difficult editorial decision, which, of course, I'm sure we all accept. The BBC Scotland gave extensive coverage to the question around Scotland's status in terms of its credit rating and the accusation that it would not get a AAA credit rating. There was a number of comments at various times covering that particular story. However, recently, when Standard & Poor, a well-known credit rating agency, produced a report, which you did cover, and Douglas Fraser, I thought, did a good job in covering it. But in that report by Standard & Poor, they said, even excluding North Sea output and calculating per capita GDP only by looking at onshore income, Scotland would qualify for our highest economic assessment. That was probably, from my point of view certainly, one of the most interesting and important statements in that report. Why was that not covered by the BBC?
I don't have the detail in front of me with regard to that. But if you're asking in terms of Douglas Fraser, the report that you refer to, you say that he made an excellent report. In terms of the judgment that is made, as I said before, it's an ongoing news judgment that our staff are making each day. So across our outlets, I cannot confirm that we didn't cover it, whether that was online or whether it was in the broadcast that you heard. But I would need to go back and research that.
My recollection is that we did cover it, that it was on the same day as the Standard Life story, and that it didn't lead.
You covered the Standard & Poor report. I'm asking about the very specific point, and I think very important point about their economic assessment.
I can't answer that without going back and looking again.
Okay. Well, I couldn't find it, so I find it curious. Even if it is somewhere on the online, and I'm not saying it isn't, it seems odd that such a a prominent organisation in terms of credit rating agencies would make such a statement, and that wouldn't get the coverage it deserved, given the previous coverage of the opposite view.
AAA status. We certainly did report the AAA status.
Well, I'll give you the quote of what was actually said about that, but I mean, we don't want to get into. I don't want to get into
my recollection is that we did. I'm very happy to go back and look again. And as I say, it was a big, busy news day. And my recollection is that broke quite late in the day. But I'm very happy to go back and look at it again.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Can I thank, on behalf of the committee, all of you for coming along this morning and answering your questions. We're very grateful for your time, and I'm sure all of the committee is very grateful for the responses you've given. And can I suspend the meeting briefly?